Hi everybody, I am going to read a story to you today about Harriet Tubman. We're going to talk about why was Monday a holiday for Martin Luther King Jr. And to do that, we have to go back in history. So we're going to go back a few hundred years and talk about why things went on in the United States, and not good things that went on, but we have to talk about it. It's important to know so that we understand why Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was so important that we have a national holiday because of him. So I'm going to start with our book. It's a picture book of Harriet Tubman. And it's a time in the United States when the United States, it wasn't a great place for some people who lived in the United States. The African Americans were owned as slaves, and we'll talk about it as I'm reading in the story. So, Harriet Tubman was born in 1820 or 1821 on a large plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland. Although the plantation had a big house with many rooms and fine furniture, Harriet was born in a small one-room log hut far behind the big house. The hut she was born in had a dirt floor, no windows, and no furniture. Harriet was the sixth of 11 children. Her father, Benjamin Ross, and her mother, Harriet Green, were both slaves. They were owned by Edward Brodess. He owned Harriet Tubman too. So back in the time that we're talking about, there were people who could own other people. So we know now, we don't believe in that as being right. It's morally wrong. But back then, it's what happened. And so that's where we have to talk about the history and where this comes from. So back then, a white person would own a farm or a plantation, and then they would own Black African Americans, and they would use them as slaves to work on their farm and their plantation. All right. The slaves worked hard all day, but they weren't paid. Harriet hated slavery. She was wild and often beaten. She was not willing to do as she was told. One time when Harriet was hired out to work for someone else, she saw a bowl filled with lumps of sugar. She said later, "Now you know, I never had anything good, no sweet, no sugar, and that sugar right by me did look so nice." She took one lump from the bowl. Remember, one lump, okay? Harriet's mistress, Miss Susan, saw her take it and chased after her with a whip. Harriet ran from the house and hid with the pigs. She ate potato peelings and other scraps until she was so hungry she had to go back. When she did, she was whipped again and again. So this is how the slaves were treated. One lump of sugar, and Harriet was whipped for that. Edward Brodess, now remember that's Harriet's slave owner, sold lumber, apples, wheat, and corn that grew on his plantation. Sometimes he took slaves he owned and sold them too down the river to plantations farther south. Harriet saw two of her sisters taken away in chains. Harriet was afraid that one day she would also be sold. So that's one of the things that happened to our slave families, is that they would be separated and split apart, and you never knew. It was up to the plantation owner who could decide at a moment's notice. Maybe the father would get sold off, maybe the mother would get sold off, maybe some of the kids would get sold off. So families were torn apart from each other. And so Harriet saw two of her sisters, and she did not want that to happen to her. When Harriet was a young girl, abolitionists, people against slavery, were beginning to speak out and protest. Abolitionist newspapers were being published. Nat Turner, a young slave, knew how Moses had led the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. He hoped to lead his people out of slavery too. And in 1831, he started a rebellion. So a rebellion is where they're going to rise up and they're going to say, no, we aren't going to take this anymore. But here's what happened. Slave owners, their wives, and their children were killed. Nat Turner and others were caught and hanged. Harriet dreamed that one day a true Moses would lead her to freedom. In 1835, Harriet came between a master and a slave who was running away. The master threw a metal weight at the runaway. It hit Harriet instead and almost killed her. Harriet had a deep cut in her forehead that never fully healed. For the next almost 80 years, Harriet suffered from severe headaches and sleeping spells, but she survived and thanked God for saving her. After the accident, she often prayed. In 1844, Harriet married John Tubman, a free man. They lived in a cabin near the Brodus plantation. Harriet was thinking about running away. She wanted John to join her, but he wouldn't. He said that if she ran off, he would tell her master, and soon the patrollers and their dogs would be after her. But Harriet had made up her mind. She started planning her escape. So now Harriet's husband is going to tell on her. He's free, but he's going to tell on her because she wants to escape to freedom. Slaves often sang in the fields. The afternoon before Harriet ran off, she sang too, and in the words of her song was a message to the other slaves. When that chariot comes, I'm going to leave you. I'm bound for the promised land. For Harriet Tubman, the promised land was north, where she would be free. So this is what you need to know, that those southern states, they allowed slaves, but the northern states did not. So that's where Harriet wants to get to. Harriet escaped at night with 3 of her brothers. They had no food, no money, and they didn't know where to go. Soon after they left, Harriet's brothers decided to turn back. They made Harriet go back too. 2 nights later, Harriet went off alone. I had a right to liberty or death, she said after her escape. If I could not have one, I would have the other. So that's telling you she was willing to die to be free. So pretty important to understand. Harriet ran to the house of a white woman who had once offered to help her. The woman told Harriet which house to go to next. The people in the second house directed Harriet to another house farther north. Harriet was traveling on what was known as the Underground Railroad. Each stop on the railroad was the house of someone who believed slavery was wrong and was willing to help runaway slaves find their way to freedom. Harriet hid during the day. She traveled at night until she reached Pennsylvania. There was a law in that state against owning slaves. So now, this isn't a real railroad like with tracks and a train. This is an underground railroad, so it's a secret, and it would help the slaves. People along the way at each of the houses would help the slaves get to the next house and then to the next house so they could get to the north where you could be free. Harriet Tubman was a free woman. She felt like a new person. She said later, the sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. During the years between 1850 and 1860, Harriet worked as a cook, dishwasher, and cleaning woman. She used much of the money she earned to make 19 trips south to lead about 300 slaves to freedom. Many of them were her own relatives. Harriet took them from one safe house to the next. Sometimes she led them as far as Canada. She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. So now a conductor on a train is the one who makes sure it gets where it's going, and that's what Harriet was. She would do that for the slaves. She helped others then escape to freedom like she did. At times, Harriet disguised herself as a weak old woman or as a man. She used songs as a secret code. When the runaways were hiding and it was safe to come out, she sang a joyful song, "Hail, oh hail, ye happy spirits." The runaway slaves always recognized Harriet's deep, husky voice. Once slaves began their journey north with Harriet, she wouldn't let them turn back. When slaves were too scared to go on, Harriet pointed a gun at their heads and said, "You'll go on or you'll die." Now, I know that seems kind of harsh, but I want you to understand, these slaves are scared. They're escaping from the life they know and trying to get somewhere, but they're scared. But Harriet was going to make sure, I will get you to freedom. Years later, Harriet said proudly, "I never ran my train off the track. I never lost a passenger." Harriet was called Moses because she led her people out of slavery. There was a huge reward waiting for anyone who caught her, but no one ever did. So there would be signs posted that said, "Wanted, dead or alive, Harriet Tubman." In 1858, Harriet met John Brown, a leader in the movement to end slavery. He called her one of the best and bravest people in America. He called her General Tubman. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and 11 southern states withdrew from the United States. They didn't want Lincoln, a man who hated slavery, as their leader. So now, this time in history in the United States, we have it's big. So the northern states where there wasn't slavery and it wasn't allowed, said, no more slavery. And Abraham Lincoln was the president, and he said no more slavery. But the southern states said, no, we still want slavery. So they said, we're going to break away from the United States and make our own country. Well, Abraham Lincoln said no. So let's see what happens. The war between the North and South, the Civil War, began on 1812-1861. During the war, Harriet Tubman worked as a nurse and a spy for the Northern Army. She went into enemy territory and led hundreds of slaves to freedom. She helped care for slaves who ran north during the fighting. In December 1865, soon after the Civil War ended, an amendment to the U.S. Constitution was passed. Slavery was no longer allowed in the United States. So at this point, the North had won. Okay, so now there's not going to be slavery anymore. After the war, Harriet Tubman returned to her home in Auburn, New York. John Tubman had died in 1867. Now remember, that was Harriet's husband, who was a free man down in the South. In 1869, Harriet married a former slave and soldier for the Northern Army, Nelson Davis. In Auburn, she went from house to house selling vegetables. Wherever she went, she was asked to tell about her adventures on the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman helped many former slaves who came to her in Auburn. She supported the suffragist movement, which was the fight for the right of women to vote in the United States. At this time, women did not have the right to vote. So that's also why it's so important for women to vote now, because we didn't used to have that right to do that. Harriet helped establish a home in Auburn for sick, poor, and homeless Black people. When she moved into that home in 1911, she was old and weak. I can hear them bells are ringing. I can hear the angels singing, she said. Soon after that, on March 10th, 1913, she died. She was more than 90 years old. Harriet Tubman was a brave, courageous woman. She was admired and loved by the many people who knew her. She was a conductor on the railway to freedom, a Moses to her people. So that's Harriet Tubman. I'll read another book tomorrow, and you can see that as we go along our history to find out why Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was so important that we have a national holiday for him.